Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hello, listeners. Today we have a special treat. We have a guest, Peter Kramer, who is a psychiatrist and the author of the New York Times and international bestseller, Listening to Prozac, which will be reformatted by Penguin in a 30th anniversary edition this fall. It's a really important book. Hope you will all jump on that. His 7 other books include Against Depression, Should You Leave, and Ordinarily Well. And he's with us today to discuss his second novel, Death of the Great Man, which was featured by the National Book Review as one of last month's 5 hot books. The novel's protagonist is the psychotherapist who is coerced into treating the nation's leader, a buffoonish narcissistic autocrat, in his disastrous and stolen second term. As readers, we are privy to Farber's thoughts as he struggles to maintain an empathic stance with a most challenging patient. Dr. Kramer is an emeritus professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University, and now he writes full-time. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you.
So, Peter, tell us how this novel came about. How did the idea occur to you? What impelled you to write it?
Yeah, so I had an epiphany. I was in New York in 2016. I was giving grand rounds at Cornell Medical School, and when I go to New York, I try to meet with editors, and I had a narrow window. My editor had a narrow window for the editor of my last book at Forest Strauss, which is in Union Square, to meet with me. So I got to Union Square early. It was raining. I went into the Barnes & Noble, and I was on the escalator going up thinking about what I'd say to this editor. And I thought, I don't want to write the book. That is the next book under contract, which I can talk about. It's still under contract. This is one of those national emergencies. I thought about the Vietnam War, and I thought everyone creative is going to be writing about what it's like to live under Trump's presidency. And I thought I would add a little tile to the mosaic, a psychotherapist, psychiatrist point of view about toxic populism. And this really just happened on the escalator. I was excited by the idea. I went into a little corner of the store, started writing notes to myself on my phone. And as I did, I thought, this is real. And I will say now, years later, obviously we're a lot of years later, the book that came out is recognizably the book I was taking notes on just after Trump's election, before he assumed office. And I went back downstairs, went outside, called my agent, and I said, this is what I want to do. And I have one of these agents who, like me, really believes that writing has to be a zone of freedom. And he said, yeah, go ahead. So I went to the meeting with the editor, and I said, I hate to say this, but, I know we have a book under contract, but I think I want to write this novel. And the agent said, by no means, we don't want that book. It was a major publisher. They take a long time to go to press. What if you do a sort of a Trump satire, Trump pastiche, and Trump dies some kind of poignant death, in the meanwhile they're stuck with this book. They just don't like doing politically related fiction. And I thought, I don't know, I'm writing this book.
Okay.
and I, lots of other things got in the way. There were plenty of other projects, but one way or another, this book came into being, and sadly not while Donald Trump was in office, but just after.
Well, you might have another chance.
That's true, which might be very timely. Because it is set in this fictional second term of a someone who has some resemblance to Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, I love that the epiphany came while you were going up, ascending into the higher realms. And I'm also picking up on what you said about how writing has to be a zone of freedom. And you said in the book, which is a little, more than a little, but a lesson and a demonstration of, how one does psychotherapy. And that the same thing is true in a psychotherapist's office, that there has to be a zone of freedom.
Yeah. And I think the epiphany is there too. I mean, I think I often am trying quickly in my mind, or was when I was doing psychotherapy, to decide among alternative responses, and I find myself speaking. I learn what I was about to say because I've said it.
That what's needed in the moment just presents itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Leston Haven said something very funny about that. He was talking to a Callow trainee, and he said, if you feel you just must say something, you shouldn't say it, because psychotherapy should come, out of this realm of freedom, which I thought was an extremely paradoxical remark, because, of course, when we feel we must just say something, we largely do say it. But I thought it was very funny, exactly where in that spectrum of impulse and, caution the interpretations arise.
And sometimes the impulse is some kind of necessary input from the unconscious, which is part of the process. That where did that come from? And that I had.
No, we don't want to be too cautious.
Right. Yeah. And Jung said that, whenever things were at a standstill, that, something would arise from the unconscious to sort of break the deadlock. So I think there's room in this zone of freedom for, all kinds of things. And we want to be reflective and thoughtful and allow some of those other kinds of inputs to enter the room as well.
One of the things, Peter, there's many things I'd like to bring up, but in the opening of the novel, that the psychiatrist, in a sense, has been captured, really doesn't seem to have much of a choice, that this relationship has been arranged, and he doesn't have the autonomy, it seems, or the political strength to separate from giving treatment to the great man, or at least almost tricking the great man into receiving treatment, because the great man thinks the psychiatrist is just a quote-unquote consultant for his insomnia. But I was also thinking clinically how there are sometimes we'll initiate treatment with certain characters and then feel that we kind of are caught. That it's not a simple thing, a couple of sessions in to say, oh, wow, this is going to be really tough, or I've gotten myself into a deeper pit than I thought this was going to be. And there is a certain strong resistance. This feels like psychologically there's we've been mated, in a sense, and caught.
No, I mean, I think that's right. Henry Farber is lucky in that he has a great faith in the method. So it's true that the great man thinks he's being treated for insomnia, which was one of Henry Farber's early specialties. And Henry Farber has moved to the treatment of paranoid men, so that maybe the great man is being treated for some kind of personality problem without knowing it. But Farber just believes that if you sit beside the patient, look out at the world as he does, that good things will happen. So he's not someone who tailors his treatment to insomnia on the one hand and paranoia on the other. It's sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of psychotherapy, and that, you know, gives the dynamic to the book, so he doesn't have to, he's not fooling anyone, he's just doing what he does. And he, you know, hopes and believes that people benefit from it. But of course, he has this enormous dialogue about ethics within himself. You know, what does it mean to treat someone who's very powerful and largely destructive? Will you make him function better in the against the national and international interests? And Farber himself is very apolitical, is not even that politically aware. But his late wife, you know, I have the political commentary come in memory effectively from the late wife. The late wife really thought that this, this national leader was destructive. He was running a thanatocracy. He didn't see a death he didn't like. You know, he was letting global warming proceed, and there were deaths from that. He was banning abortion, and there were deaths from that. Cutting back on health care, deaths from that. So that Farber is aware that he may be forwarding an agenda that he himself opposes.
So that issue of, is he being complicit by giving aid to the enemy in some way?
And I think he really clings to this. You know, he adores his profession. By the way, I adore my profession.
It really comes across, by the way.
Yeah. So he's willing to bet everything on just treating this patient as he treats others, not giving VIP treatment. You know, and that's part of the fun, the dynamic between this extremely narcissistic patient and this humble doctor who effectively is enforcing some humility upon the patient because he's not treating him any differently than he would treat anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Henry Farber is really a psychotherapist, a depth-oriented psychotherapist, a dynamic psychotherapist through and through. You know, he really, his personality is very clear, and these sort of, you know, he makes comments from time to time about, you know, how the method is sort of seeped into his personality, and this is just how he conducts his life. And I really appreciated that. And like I said, you know, your love for the profession, you know, I was imagining was being spoken through Henry Farber. So I appreciated that. And, you know, just that kind of radical curiosity that we have to cultivate about, you know, just at the same time that we're taking in information and evaluating patterns and making connections, at the same time we have just this sort of radical openness to what's coming into the space with us.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my third book was Should You Leave? And it was about the role of advice, partly. It was about intimacy, but about the role of advice in psychotherapy. And when I was in training, the ideal was to be fully empathic, and I'm a kind of a pragmatic guy by personality, and I had to work out what the right oscillation was between really just accepting everything the patient says and this external view where you think, hold on a minute, if you behave that way in public, you know, what will result? And you know, and so that book, and you know, in Should You Leave, I write about times that some of the great psychotherapists who were committed to their methods stepped out of them to give forceful advice. You know, Harry Stack Sullivan saying, you know, good God, what will become of that? You know, if you know, to a patient, sort of stopping a patient in the patient's tracks, and you know, plenty of other of the great psychotherapists did the same.
Yeah, I mean, confrontation is one of our most important tools.
And I don't think that empathy and honesty is what I would call it, you know, are in opposition to one another. You know, I think if somebody said, to come up with a silly example, that 2 and 2 are 5, you know, we could, without a lot of activation and arousal, simply say, you know, I don't think so. You know, let's walk through that one more time and just see.
Yes, I mean, there's one of the examples in Should You Leave, and I'm forgetting the therapist who was the great psychoanalyst who settled in Kohut. It was Kohut, was someone who really believed in just interpreting the material, and he had a patient who was afraid of being accused of being resistant because he came late to therapy, so he ran a number of red lights and, sped and drove badly on the way to the office, and Kohut just, stopped the session and said, no, you can't do that. You're going to, came entirely outside the therapy to say, that's not what I'm asking of you.
In the book, you have the main character, Henry Farber, say, "My interest is to work with what patients choose to present until they correct themselves," which I thought was a wonderfully adroit and subtle way of saying some of what we're talking about now.
I think it's especially true in paranoia that you don't want to say, really, they're listening to you through the television? You don't want to doubt the claims. You want to work with those as the patient's reality, hoping that at a certain point they'll say, well, I don't fully believe that. I'm aware that that's unlikely. And then that's gold. The little bit of doubt.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think the other issue that we've been talking about indirectly is this question of, what do we do with patients who are dislikable or whose views we disagree with? And certainly as a therapist, I had patients who were very dedicated politically to causes that I disagreed with. And I also did some little bits of work in prison and in my private practice with people who had committed crimes. And I had actually a big part of the practice was people referred to me, doctors largely, from hospitals because they were not getting along with colleagues or coworkers, nurses, social workers. So inherently, they were being referred because they didn't get along with people very well, and they were not immediately likable. So I think I had a practice. Not to, if my patients are listening, I loved all of you, but I think part of the art is finding, what has some texture, what the bits of humanity are, what the good points are in people who've done quite horrible things. The other example is, we deal with abuse, but sometimes what we're dealing with is the abusers who need help as well, not necessarily inherently likable. So, this novel comes partly out of that experience. What is it like to deal with someone you disagree with profoundly and who treats you badly? In the novel, the great man, without giving much away, at one point really essentially throws Henry Farber into prison. And Henry, who is, a Kantian, he really believes in doing the right thing at all times in prison, thinks, maybe the way I comport myself will get back to the great man, and that will act as a sort of therapy. And then he thinks, I really should sit here and review cases that are similar and see what I did wrong in those cases to see if I'm doing those things wrong with the great man. And sure enough, that turns out to be, a useful part of the therapy.
From a Jungian perspective,
go ahead, Janice.
Excuse me. From a Jungian perspective, sometimes we'll look at a story, a myth, a fairy tale, and we'll imagine that the entire story is happening in a single psyche, that it's like a dream analysis. Yeah. And so when you were in the dungeon, in the oubliette, I was thinking that if we imagined a psyche, where there's a sensitive ego, even a psychotherapist, and then there's this inner figure that's this kind of predatory narcissist. As happens with complexes, we can have split off aspects of self that are marauding around. I thought the descent into the dungeon was very much like Jung's story of the night sea journey, that sometimes the individual is plunged into a kind of helpless depression, a kind of internal place where they are deflated. And I was thinking about the Kleinian idea, the great man is in that kind of manic defense, rage, biting, wants everything. Mm-hmm. And then there's this translation of Farber into the depressive position, the introspection. He's reviewing his relationship with his wife. Was I a good husband? Was it, all the mistakes I made? And that tension between the inflated mania and the depressive self-reflection is something that happens in a psyche as well. So it had a fairy tale quality to me.
Yes, I think it's meant to have a fairy tale quality. Thank you. And I think the examination of the marriage, that he's in the dungeon trying to think what he has done that's comparable, what he's done where he has mistreated someone. And he finds aspects of the marriage where he could have done better. Now, of course, where all of this is a little comical because the contrast between his sins and the great man's sins is so vast. The fact that he can find a similarity is, he's comically devoted to psychotherapy in a way, in the way that the great man is a comical version of what goes on in our politics. Yes, I think the dungeon is very much meant to be a journey. It's one of those, those places where a journey takes place. And people have asked me, why is the wife dead? And the wife's probably dead for a lot of reasons, but I think why wives or husbands are dead in a lot of movies and novels and so on is it makes them very portable. So you can have the wife, with you in the dungeon and work out what's going on, as if you were anywhere, because she's not there anyway. Structurally in the book, because he has to leave Providence and go to the great man's lair, that was easier without a wife to say, hey, what happened to my husband? Where is he? So that was structurally an issue for the book. But yes, I think that the whole point of that disappearance is to take a journey.
And it also enlarges that frame that Joseph was mentioning of that it's like a fairy tale, that then it's clear that his wife is an internal part of him, and he can reflect on what she said or might have said. And that's one of the things I enjoyed the most about the book was Henry Farber's capacity for self-reflection. And isn't that at the heart of what we do? What about that? Why did I do that? I wonder if I could have, why that came up. I'm curious about that. That if we can have those recursive loops that this character models so well, we're a lot better off. We're a lot more conscious.
I think we, talk about sometimes a teacher or parent being an external superego or external ego. And in a way, Henry Farber has this external critical part. He really can't think ill of anyone, but he does have within him awareness of his wife's viewpoint, which would be less uniformly generous.
On this issue of what we feel and how do we work with someone who's unlikable? Farber's deceased mentor, I think his name is Hans Lutz, do I have that right?
Yes.
Says at some point something like, your job is to pay attention to how you feel, or maybe he even says to know how you feel, and everything else flows from that. That's my paraphrase, Peter. I don't know if I got it just right, but I kind of loved that as a guidepost for doing psychotherapy. And I think where I have sometimes faltered is in working with someone who was difficult. I haven't allowed myself to know how I was feeling, and then I think we're in trouble. So if you deal with someone's unlikability, or someone's aggression or attacks on you by sort of splitting off your anger, hurt, fury, by just pretending you don't actually feel that, I don't find the treatment goes well. So somehow there's this very difficult thing of knowing what you're feeling, but and maybe acting from that place or speaking from that place, but not acting it out. So in the beginning, when B first comes to Henry's office, Henry thinks that's the patient, and he's kind of engaging him. And then when he sees that that's not the case, he says something like, "Oh, I was so relieved that I didn't have to find empathy for him."
Yeah.
So it can be kind of hard. It can be very difficult work to hold on to our own perspective
Yes.
of, God, this guy's really a prick.
Yeah.
At the same time that we're trying to listen with that open-hearted stance.
No, I think that I love that. To me, that's the funniest scene in the book. It comes early, but there's this whole kind of pantomime with somebody who is trying to get something through this therapist, and the therapist thinks he's a patient and is treating him as if he were paranoid. And not that he isn't paranoid, but on this particular issue, he has a point to make. In one of my early books, I think Moments of Engagement, and this may be wrong, I had this moment where I was with a patient feeling a little uncomfortable, and I noticed that one of my plants had some kind of excrescence on it. I used to know the name for this problem, but it's some kind of white patches that were on the stem of the plant. And I realized, I'm thinking about sexual disgust. I'm thinking about like infections and then I wonder whether that's what's going on with the patient, whether she has some sexual self-disgust that we're not thinking about together. And it was, one of those complicated moments. Who knows when we have them, whether they're right or wrong, and whether our own narcissism is involved. But I think being aware of the unpleasantness, really can set you in a new direction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It all kind of maps onto something that Jung has, a diagram that looks like the Scottish flag. It's a rectangle with two lines going up to each corner. And that the idea is to relate to the client, sort of ego to ego of how was it getting here, or your example of Kohut saying, you can't drive dangerously. And to try to relate to the patient's unconscious, which is what you were just saying, is what's going on here that we might not be addressing, and also to relate to our own reaction and what's going on inside us. So we hopefully have three different directions of reflection going at the same time. And that goes back to what you said, Lisa, about Hans Lutz, the fictional supervisor, who says your goal is to know how you feel. Mm-hmm. The rest follows.
I don't know why I put that Hans Lutz scene in there, but I am fond of that. So Henry Farber goes and visits his mentor, and the mentor is entering dementia. Mm-hmm. And nonetheless, somehow in the interaction, the mentor has the same effect on Hans Lutz that he did when the mentor was sharp and being an instructor and so on. And I had that experience twice. Twice I visited, old teachers of mine when they were in nursing homes and somewhat demented, and I sat with them and I thought, oh my God, he can still do it. He kind of threw me, these were men, he can throw me back on myself, make me self-conscious and anxious and wondering, how I'm behaving. And some of it, I think, is that it gets overlearned. And I have an example from a third therapist. I didn't see this personally, but I had a teacher who was in a nursing home. His son was there, and a woman came down the hall who was being inappropriately sexual with him, came into his room and started talking, and he looked up at her and he said, "I'm sorry, our time is up." There's some things that you overlearn so much. You can draw on them when there's very little else left.
That's
It saved
hilarious.
him.
Oh my God, I love that story. Oh my God.
But anyway, Hans Lutz has that, and Henry Farber have that beautiful, sort of interchange where they're not firing on all cylinders, but they're still inspiring one another.
There's still something healing or transformative in the energetic encounter somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter, if I may zoom back a little bit and talk to you as a writer, of the many ways that you could have brought this information forward, why did you choose a murder mystery as a way to frame this?
So I am a great reader of European literary fiction, really world literary fiction. And one of the writers I admire is the late Javier Marias, died recently, a great Madrid-based author. And he was a very philosophical novelist. And he would start a novel with a lurid event like a murder or a rape or a grave misunderstanding or crime. And then he would sort of pull back and he would be thinking about that event, and it would free him because there was that tension that was going to pull you through the book, pull the reader through the book. It would free him to have these more philosophical thoughts. So I thought I was going to follow that route, and that was sort of the epiphany in the bookstore, that this would be a framework to start with a death and then to be able to describe character and interactions and so on, because we're curious about what happened. I mean, we have a tolerance for the narrative, the backstory, because something is going to be revealed. And I think it had a parallel to another reason for the book, which is the Goldwater rule. The psychiatrists, are prevented from publicly diagnosing people they haven't interviewed personally and from whom they don't have permission. And I thought, in a way, because his lawyer required him to recount the story, and because I set it up so that Henry Farber has some implicit permission from the great man, we are allowed to have this narrative describing the psyche of a political figure that we ordinarily, professionals are not allowed to have. Mm-hmm. So, those are sort of reasons for the setup. I love murder mysteries, and it also gives you permission to make the deceased unlikable. And the typical British village murder mystery, the deceased is someone whom a dozen people had reasons to wish dead.
Yeah.
We have that.
Yeah. That's great. I love murder mysteries too. And Jung loved crime novels. So I've been actually pondering, why do we like a good crime novel?
Yeah,
So
Freud admired Conan Doyle. I think he thought Sherlock Holmes was a lot like a psychoanalyst.
Yes. Well, it's meaning making, right? It's taking an event that disrupts meaning and then trying to make meaning of it. So there's something
And
there.
attending to small cues.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, that too.
On another tack, I just want to say that I love your story about how the novel came to you, because it sort of dropped into your head. It doesn't, maybe not fully conceived, but it was well on its way when it arrived. And I love the sense of place that you conjured, that you were in New York and it was raining and it was Union Square, and I know that Barnes and Noble and I know that escalator, and I, as a former inhabitant of Providence, I loved the way you conjured College Hill, and I loved how you changed the names of places. So there was Beneficent Street, which actually lived on Benefit and Planet, right on the corner there. So that was clever. I appreciated that. You changed Providence just a little bit, just like you would change a case history.
Yeah. Providence unchanged is so remarkable. So Planet Street was named after it was a great interest in a transit of Venus, a particular transit of Venus. And we have Transit Street and Planet Street because of the astronomy in this kind of fervor for astronomy at a certain moment. That's funny.
I didn't realize that. It was just a very cool address when I was in college.
But it does. I mean, the names of the streets in Providence do have a certain moral, weight that we have. Benefit Street and
even
so,
Providence, right? I love the name
Providence,
of the
yes,
city.
Yeah. So I thought that all went together.
Yeah, thank you
I
for
very
taking
much
me
enjoyed
back to Wickenden Street.
the evocation of the place was delightful. And I think that's one of the great allures of a mystery novel or historical fiction, is to take you somewhere and inside the houses and, what the decor is really a special pleasure.
I think I like it when novelists embrace where they are. I often have a sense that I missed out by not living in New York. I used to go to a pre-Thanksgiving party of a editor who edited biographies, and this was in New York, and he would have 50 biographers at this party, and I thought, in Providence, I have trouble getting together 3 writers, who interest me no longer. It's become more of a writer's town, and that I really missed out on all those breakfasts between biographers and the editors and the agents. And to make up for that, I want to really inhabit Providence, and I think really Providence is in all my, all my books. It's good for a writer to have a sense of place. In the COVID, I started reading French at bedtime for no good reasons, and I was reading thin books, and largely I read Patrick Modiano and Annie Ernaux, the 2 French Nobel Prize winners, although Ernaux had not won it yet. And they are, so particular about place. It's all about place. And you can read Ernaux pages and pages, and not much is happening except that you have a sense of what it's like to grow up in a poor, marginal French town. And Modiano is sort of naming the streets, street by street in Paris, and what their, what the legacies are. Anyway, so I make no claims for my fiction, but I really do draw on the best. I mean, I'm obsessed with really great fiction writing.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated the prose. It was very kind of elegant and spare, and and careful and layered. So I appreciated that. Just going back to what this book says about therapy. One of the other issues that we've touched on lightly already, but I'd love to bring this up more, is the role of reality in therapy. And again, we're listening kind of with 2 ears, because we want to make space for the reality, whatever the patient's subjective experience is, that patient's subjective reality. But we're also curious about how that maps onto or not kind of our reality or objective reality. And that comes up in the book in a few places. And of course, if you're working with someone who's paranoid, that has a special place. And I think it's an interesting, sometimes sort of difficult place in an analysis to deal with the role of reality.
So we haven't mentioned another major character in the book, which is the great man's wife or consort. And she is, some of the humor in the book is that the great man, I kind of try to out-Trump Trump, which is difficult. But the Melania figure is the opposite. She is a kind of a New York actress and sort of a dramaturge, a kind of, sort of everyday intellectual, horrified by her husband's behavior. And she manages in sneaky ways to inform Henry Farber that things that her husband is likely to say in therapy are not true. So Farber has this tension between his awareness of reality as shared with him by the wife and the things that the great man is saying in therapy, which of course creates a dilemma, as happens, often in therapy, where we know that something the patient is saying is not other people's view of what's happened. And especially in a small town like Providence, where you run into people in the market or the gym or wherever it is, and you hear from the neighbors, and you have a pretty good sense of from the outside of what happened in the marriage, and then your patient is telling you from the inside of what happened in the marriage. So, that tension is there. And I think as a reader, we suspect that what the wife is saying is likely to be the reality. And so we have these funny moments where we already know what the story is, and then we hear the great man giving a story which contrasts with it.
Yeah. It was a wonderful allusion to the multiple realities that you've just mentioned of Henry Farber knows people in Providence. It's a small town. So he's got that level. He's got a spouse's level. He's got his own reaction. He hears from the patient who's giving him the quote, inside story, unquote. But those multiple layers of reality are very important. It's portrayed in the book and isn't it an external world reality of how we deal with all of those facets?
So I have special training in this area. When I was in medical school, I knew I was going to be a psychiatrist, and I decided I would do some rural medicine to really get a feel for what it was like to be a doctor, since I was going to leave that behind, an internal medicine type doctor, going to leave that behind me. And I applied to go to Guatemala and, carry antibiotics up the hill, and Harvard didn't want to waste that on a psychiatrist, so they sent me instead to Western North Carolina and then to Martha's Vineyard, which Dukes County, which is Martha's Vineyard, was then the poorest county in Massachusetts, and I was there in the off-season, very rural, and there was a community psychiatrist here, Milton Mazer. This was in the heyday of psychoanalysis, especially at Harvard. And he said, we don't do things the same here. You're going to need a plumber. There's only one plumber, and he's going to be your patient. And so you're going to have to interact with him as a plumber and as a patient. And there's the town meeting, and you see each other at the town meeting. And he really trained me in doing psychoanalytic style therapy in a small community where everybody knows everybody's business. And I thought that was extremely valuable. He wrote a book I love called People and Predicaments, which is about Martha's Vineyard. And it's about what it's like to live in a place as a poor person where there's so much wealth on display for 2 months a year. Wow. Anyway, one of the best stories was about a kid who serviced the yachts in Edgartown and had a romance with a wealthy young woman, and the family put a stop to it. And later, he had become a doctor, this young man, and he tended to this woman on her deathbed.
Oh, my.
And she said to him, well, you should have told me you were going to become a doctor. And, that was the most outrageous thing anybody had said, but it gave a sense of the, what that experience was like.
Wow.
But anyway, in my medical school training, I was taught about the kind of psychiatry that's sort of small town psychiatry, and I thought Providence had a lot of that, even though, it's a lot larger than this island.
Peter, I'd like to drop down to another level, and I'm going to mention something personal that I had noticed in your Wikipedia page when I was learning a little bit more, that your parents are Holocaust survivors. And so the tremendous abuse of power and the trauma and the terrible things that can come out of the wrong person rising in a culture are close to your psyche, close to your history. And so I was also imagining that the book was, on some level, imagining yourself, imagining a psychiatrist engaging with a kind of despot And it goes to a question which I think is rattled around in all spheres. If somebody knew who Hitler was going to become, and you had access to them before they had a chance to do the worst things, what would you do? Would
Yes.
you? It's a big thing.
No, thank you. That's right. I mean, I think that epiphany in Union Square and so on is really based on the Holocaust. That is, I think, someone is coming to power who strikes me as dangerous and attractive. And, I think that's where that sense of obligation comes from. I was actually a book reviewer made fun of the opening to Ordinarily Well. It was a favorable review, but it made fun of the preface that says that I was writing it out of a sense of obligation. I think a lot of my books are written out of a sense of obligation, which may be private to me. But I think, yes, I did have that sense of obligation. And in the book, there is some ekphrasis, that is, there's some sort of discussion of art that's outside the book, and in particular, Karl Ove Knausgaard's analysis of Hitler, and then some discussion among the characters about would you do some kind of neutral psychotherapy with Hitler, and which is meant not to be identical to the current situation with the man, but brought to mind by it, and also the whole question of murder, which is hanging over the whole book, whether this is a murder or not. So yes, I think that is the center for me. I said that I read Patrick Modiano. So Patrick Modiano is a French author who was born just after the Second World War, I think 1946. But his father had been a small-time scoundrel, sort of a black marketeer, petty criminal in Paris in the Nazi era, during the Nazi occupation. And that is the center of all of Modiano's books. It's like a Proust who's trying to remember something, except he wasn't actually there. I think the same is true for my books in a way that is probably inapparent to readers, that the Holocaust, even though I was not there, is the center of it. My parents are what are now called Holocaust survivors. I don't know where the Wikipedia note comes from, but they escaped Germany unharmed, except psychologically. Most of the relatives died, and there were horrible incidents in the exit where they saw horrible things. So they, certainly were what we would call traumatized, although I think they largely did not like to define themselves that way.
But it's really there in the psyche.
The shadow was on me for certain.
Yes.
Of course.
And it I don't know, it brings up for me this thought about sort of ethics and psychotherapy, and I guess I believe that analysis is kind of an ethical field in a way, because ultimately it's about promoting consciousness. So it's not ethically neutral, in fact, what we do, because, and I think Jung would stand by this, that to make something conscious is a profoundly important and kind of progressive act and pro-social thing to help someone become more conscious, or to become more conscious ourselves.
Yes, I think when I say that Farber is dedicated to the method, and the method to him is sort of neutral. It's neutral as regards patients' subsequent choices, but it's not neutral as regards bringing things to consciousness.
Yes.
And that itself, it seems to me, is political in our era. That is, it seems to me that some of the kind of MAGA Republican ideology is against subtlety. And it is saying, come on, guys, this is obvious on its surface, let's not dig too deep. And that allows things like book banning in Florida, and so in a sense, although we want for the therapy to be neutral, there is a sense in this novel that neutrality in itself is somewhat in opposition to the great man's sense of how business ought to be conducted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I would personally agree with what you've said, and also offer that some of the ideologies on the left are also sucking out subtlety too. So
oh yes, I actually don't have to be prodded to agree. I think that's right. I think we are in an era where the political extremes lack all subtlety.
Yes. And of course, subtlety is is such a part of what we do. Like you said before, listening to subtle cues, being aware of the both and.
But is that being a snowflake? You know what I mean? Is there? And I think, to me, it's not. I think you can be tough as nails and still analytic and thoughtful.
I would agree.
Peter, there were also, I wanted to just bring up, I'm not sure whether you thought of the novel as particularly symbolic, whether that was a lens that you were using, but there were certain little secret bits that showed up in the novel that were, I just thought, really meaningful, like the Ezra phone, where, and the character of Ezra, people may not know, but he was a substantial leader in the 5th century and reestablished Jewish law as he led people from the Babylonian exile back to Jerusalem and read them the Mosaic Code to reconstellate a law-abiding, aligned community having been in exile, which is exactly, of course, the hope that one would have after the death of the great man. And this huge story was like floating just in the Ezra phone for people that might just know the association a bit.
No, I had no notion, but I do think I was trying to pick a name that would sound contemptuous to people who were anti-Semitic, but sort of noble to people who were sympathetic. So I think maybe I had, the remnant of that detail without the content.
Oh, that's wonderful. The unconscious just kind of put a little jewel right there.
I'm curious, Peter, I'm taking a kind of dogleg turn in one direction or another about some of your other books and some of your other work for which you are very, very well known, starting with listening to Prozac, which is coming out again in another edition after 30 years, and your book on intimacy with couples, and that's a huge part of your professional experience.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky with listening to Prozac. It has a funny origin story as well. I was very much in love with my, the woman who would become my wife, and decided to leave Yale to be in the DC area where she was. And one of my residency supervisors said, well, if you do extra work for me for a semester, I will let you be supervised in DC by a Yale professor who was down there, Walter Reich, who later became head of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And so I went down there to do work in community psychiatry in the federal government, helping community mental health centers. And by the time I arrived, because there was this semester delay, that job was gone, and I was assigned to work with Jerry Clairman, who was Harvard and Yale-based psychiatrist who was head of the agency that oversaw NIMH and some other institutes. And I had to learn the whole United States research portfolio, everything that NIMH did, the Veterans Association. So I was explaining science to Congress and explaining the Carter administration's priorities to scientists. And then when I was in practice, not that long after, I started prescribing Prozac and had a sense the patients were telling me that they had these personality changes on medication. But because I'd been in the government and knew all the leading scientists, I mean, we had the money, they came to us, I was sort of uniquely this person who was interested in community psychiatry, interested in psychotherapy, but happened to have a very extensive knowledge of the current research portfolio. So that allowed me to write that book. And the listening to Prozac is really the psychotherapeutic stance, and the Prozac is the sort of then cutting edge of pharmacotherapy. So that was sort of the origin of that book, and I was able to go to people like Donald Klein and say, I'm thinking of writing this book, tell me what you think, and he would send me 60 papers in the days when papers, were on paper.
Wow.
And you could speak.
Yeah.
So there was an enormous amount of work and research to write that book, but I was well prepared in terms of the background, knew pretty much what the answers were going to be. So that book is really about the idea that when you try to design antidepressants based on these neurotransmitters, you're going to end up with drugs that affect personality. And what's interesting in the 30 years that have passed is that we have much more complexity in our notion of how antidepressants work, and it's pulled away a little from serotonin. But in terms of the combating neuroticism, in terms of the personality effects, that still does seem to be serotonin driven. So the book was effectively right on target, that these medicines are more anti-neuroticism drugs probably than they are directly antidepressants, although they do both. So that's what the 30. I mean, this book has been in print for 30 years, which not many others can say, and actually selling. And I didn't revise the text, but I wrote a new introduction and afterward, which will be out in the fall.
Can you say more about your idea here that they're more anti-neuroticism? Because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, so patients came to me and said when they were, on the medicine, they said the episode of depression is over, but I'm also feeling more comfortable socially, I'm less anxious, I'm better dating, and so on. And I tried to think about why that was, and then patients who said, I'm myself at last, and I thought, would they never have been themselves if this drug hadn't been invented and marketed and so on. And so that was really what the book was about. And the medicines are good antidepressants, but it's possible that there just is some new research, which I won't go into here, that they're antidepressant effects are through other mechanisms that are not centrally related to serotonin. I don't actually think that's going to be true, but at the moment, I'd say there's some scientists who think that that's. But in any case, what the antidepressants have in common, and what they have in common with the psychedelics like ketamine and so on, and that are psilocybin being tested for depression treatment, is they seem to allow the brain to be more resilient and to almost pull it back into a critical learning period like what you have in infancy, where it's possible to really reshape. And what I say in Against Depression and Ordinarily Well is it's possible that it really is the combination of making the brain more pliable and psychotherapy that is most beneficial and is sort of the best use of these drugs. But when you think about the anti-neuroticism effect, it's also possible without psychotherapy that if a drug has these two effects, it makes the brain more plastic and it makes people less anxious and self-conscious and so on. You're getting some kind of inbuilt psychotherapy effect from the drug at a moment when you're able to relearn. So, it may be that we just got very lucky with those drugs.
Peter, if I may ask, I'm going to take another little turn. As you're kind of resting back in your office, watching where your mind is going naturally, What's the next area of interest that's just brewing in your psyche?
Yeah,
Where's
what's your next book?
curiosity going? Perhaps a book, but more largely, where's your curiosity
Well,
going?
I actually have a book that is almost written, and it was almost written a while ago, and it has to do with retirement. So I had this strange, to me, phenomenon, which is I stopped seeing patients about 5 years ago. It was pre-COVID, and to become a writer full time. And it took a while to wind down the practice, and there were lots of things I still had to do. So I was still a part-time writer and part-time doing things related to the business of psychotherapy, let's say, of psychiatry. But eventually I became a writer full time, and friends started treating me as retired. And I thought, I always wrote half day. Now I'm writing the whole day. Why am I retired? And I started thinking about what retirement is. And retirement, turns out to be this very interesting topic. And, there are two issues. One is what is it, and the other is what's at stake. So why am I so resistant to the idea of being retired? And I understand there's, when you not only stop seeing patients, but also move from nonfiction to fiction, as I was doing at the time, writing this book, Death of the Great Man, that there's sort of a thin line between, a professional writer who's turning to fiction and an old man with a hobby. It's, like, what is it that you're doing? And then I turned a little to the sociology of retirement and what really do we make of it? But I'm under contract for a book about work and happiness, and I'm hoping that this retirement book will fill that slot for the publisher. It will or it won't. But I thought I'm going to meet work and happiness where I am, which is on this boundary of, insisting that I'm being fully employed and being treated by friends will call up and, during the COVID winter, which was the book is set in December of 2020, people would call up and say, let's take a walk. We'd take walks with masks in those days. I'm listening. The door has come open here. I'm going to close it. My wife, after an hour, is having trouble not being on the phone. So let me close this door.
I can so relate to what Peter's been saying because I think I work by myself.
Let me tell you one thing from the sociology of retirement that I just think is interesting, which is imagine you have two people, let's say two men, who have the same job, the same religion, the same background, same assets, same interests, and they're forced out and they take a second lesser job. These are old people, say they're in their late 60s, early 70s. And one of them says, I'm worried about myself financially. I really need this job. I'm employed. I'm, taking care of my needs. And the other one is only different from the first one in this one regard, which is personality. And he says, I'm done with my work life. I'm enjoying this other job. I like being employed. I don't really need the money. I'll leave it whenever I want. And a sociologist would call the first one fully employed and the second one retired but working during retirement at what's called a bridge job. So that there's no metric that tells you whether someone is employed or retired. And that's especially true when these are not W-2 jobs, where you get health benefits and retirement benefits and a W-2 form from your employer. They're called non-traditional jobs. And half of people in retirement are in jobs, and most of those are non-traditional jobs, and half of the elderly are employed. I mean, it's regardless of income, up and down the income scale. People are largely in these non-W-2 jobs in retirement.
That's really interesting.
Some of them will say they're not retired. So that's sort of the framework.
I think what I'm pulling out of that, and I'm checking it out with you, is one aspect seems to be the non-traditional jobs of, working at home.
Yes.
Rather than going to an office with all the, HR department and paycheck.
Right.
And then the other is what gets projected, certainly onto me, is that at this time of life, I'm not really working.
Right.
You work a little bit, or you work when you want. You set your own hours. You come and go as you wish.
Yeah.
So you're available
Yes.
to take a walk or spend a weekend, or any
Yes.
one of because that's considered normative.
Right.
I think as soon as you have gray hair.
No, I think you absolutely captured it. I mean, let's say you're in your 20s and you decide, I'm going to walk away from my W-2 employment and be a writer or an actor.
Yeah.
And do that full time, and you're working at it assiduously, and no one says, as you are, you're retired. I mean, it's only when you have gray hair. I mean, maybe not only, but yes, I think the critical variable is age, and then the cultural construction of age.
Yeah.
Peter, I'd like to ask you one really serious question here at the end. We can all sit in the weight of it.
You can see that I'm braced for it.
Yes,
There
exactly.
you go. What do you wish that we had asked you, but we had not?
I don't have a wish, but I do have something I wonder about, which is I feel in this strange state where I've written a book that seems to be extremely timely, and a book I hear good things about. It's gotten very few reviews, but the reviews it's gotten are extremely favorable. It doesn't seem to be an embarrassment. And, how is it that this podcast aside, this book has not gotten, some ordinary book attention like mainstream reviews, feature pieces? It does seem, and I wonder also, as I said earlier, why other creative people have not taken this on. There was a book by Dave Eggers that was a Trump pastiche that I guess didn't sell well for Knopf, and maybe that discouraged people. But why didn't it sell well? Why is this topic seemingly kryptonite? So, it's not that I wish to discuss that, but I do think I'm puzzled by it every day. And I think, there are plenty of venues that almost discuss the book. They call me up, they're getting prepared, and, nothing happens. And I, partly it's that I'm spoiled as an author. I mean, ordinarily got 3 reviews in the New York Times. I mean, 3.
Wow.
Who can say that?
Wow.
It's ridiculous. And, then for this to get none. So I think it's interesting. I think there's something I haven't properly grappled with about the nature of my own novel.
Well, I wonder if, I'm coming up somewhat blank as you pose that question, but I wonder if there's something we all haven't grappled with about the moment we're living in. And I think it probably has to do with this changed landscape that is so polarized that it feels a little hard, at least for me, to even know how to formulate my reaction to things sometimes.
Yeah,
So-
how do we get out of this? I sometimes I think what will happen is there'll just be a moment where the extreme polarization fades and we are in denial. We sort of seal over as if it had never happened. Or does it just go on for a very long time? We don't want to turn into Poland or some country where only one viewpoint is expressible. It's really, but it is puzzling what the way out is, and I think it is.
Yeah.
Maybe for us as psychotherapists, I'm a psychiatrist, but I think primarily was always a psychotherapist.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how is it that there's no movement away from what's basically hatred?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. And it's very distressing. And there are organizations that are trying to combat it. And I think we on This Jungian Life try to do our part because we want to hew to Jung's dictate to hold the tension of the opposites. And I think that is, besides being very Jungian, I think, as we've discussed in this episode, it is kind of the heart of psychotherapy as well. But I agree. I don't know what happens next either.
One of the things I'd like to say, Peter, and I couldn't possibly make a comment about the publishing industry and all of that, but I was paying attention to what the book constellated in me and how it affected my psyche. It was hard to revisit the pain. We've had this couple of years of freedom, from the incredible amount of anxiety. So there was something painful about just going and having the context, the personality re-evoked so vividly to want to stand in that again, because it was so really difficult, and I'm understating it. And moving through that, dancing through the plot, and then finally to the end, there's a feeling in the story that if someone had not dispatched the great man, that this would have just gone on and on. That therapist would have been in that oubliette, that he would still be in that building,
right.
That this overwhelming, irrational, dangerous power would just have kept turning forward. So the ending where again he is dispatched, it was hard for my body to believe it.
Yeah.
There was like a Deus ex machina, it was like
yes.
There's a sudden intervention of spirit and the problem's gone, but then there's a part of my psyche that's like, oh gosh, this whole problem is right in my face, and it's not really gone.
Yeah.
And I've got to keep my hands on this, of course, as we're coming up to another iteration. So it's a call to arms. It's remembering something that's really scary and painful, and all the distress during that time. It's a lot to sit with.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And I think, yes, I think if the book had been widely reviewed and discussed, but didn't sell that well because people, who favor Trump didn't want to read it, and people who are relieved that Trump isn't around also didn't want to read it, that wouldn't have surprised me. It's because it is, I think, for some people, why would I spend my novel reading time reading about something that was already difficult for me? Yeah. But it's more the silence, I think, has me spooked. But I appreciate, I think, I think literary fiction should be difficult in some ways, and
right.
I'm trying to make it comical enough that you get drawn through it, but it's difficult. It's difficult, and our circumstances are difficult.
Peter, there, you're back. The video's back. I'm thinking about the same thing, that when we hold the tension of the opposites, which we do try to do, but the idea is that a third thing will appear that is neither one thing or the other, not good, not bad, not black or white, but something new that we couldn't just think about or think of or conjure up cognitively. And I wonder if that's part of this dilemma, is the third thing in our culture has not emerged. So we're sort of oscillating back and forth between extremes on the right, extremes on the left, polarization everywhere, waiting, hoping for the third to emerge. And of course, there's a clear point of view in the book.
Yeah.
The great man is, in fact, not so great.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also an element that I'm wondering about, Peter, which goes to Freud's totem and taboo. That, and you can see this in the media. There was a big swell of criticism for Trump and a almost heroic audacity that has kind of evaporated from kind of public discourse, and Trump is in the background on Wired and in private networks. But I think that there's a certain fear about poking the beast,
Yeah.
a certain anxiety that people undoubtedly are privately talking a lot about it, but the courage it took for you to stand up, write that book, and just put a stick right into that hornet's nest, and the courage to do that, which we depend on artists and thinkers and heroes to do that. But I can feel the ripple of concern. It's like, how far back away from the bear, should one be? So I think the courage of going right up against something that's so scary and something that is still in play creates a kind of crackling intensity about it, and takes yet another extra step for someone to reach across and take hold of the book, the idea, the position, revisiting it, takes more courage. So all of that seems so layered.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't think I'm personally courageous, but I think I'm very much buffered by both psychiatry and writing as professions, that this is just what we do as writers, or what writers do.
Yeah.
But I agree, I sort of worried, is someone going to be at my mailbox or front door, or, so I guess I do have that worry, but I don't experience it as courage, and I hope I don't have to.
Of course, of course.
Well, and maybe that's a good place to wrap up and switch over to a dream. And we're so pleased that Peter is going to join us for the dream segment. We usually give guests a choice, and some people don't want to join us, and but Peter does, which is great. So we have a more, I'm imagining more of a kind of slightly Freudian take, Peter, on dreams, perhaps. I'm making an assumption there, but looking forward to it. So today's dreamer is a 29-year-old woman who works as a social worker, and she has titled her dream, Freeing the Zebra in Me. I'm at the zoo with my mother. We make our way into an outdoor exhibit where there is a crowd of people. I make my way to the front of the crowd and see there are zebras in a circular pen. Inside the pen, each zebra has its own circular pen to stand in. The walls of each pen, including the large outer one, are short, and I think the zebras could simply walk over them if they chose, but they stand still. I think there are 5 zebras in all, 1 in the center and 4 around the edges. My mom remarks on how wonderful the zoo is. As soon as she says this, I realize how horrible this is. Zebras are meant to be able to run and be outside. Here they are caged, unable to be their true zebra selves. Worst of all, no one seems to care. I quickly become enraged, wanting to advocate for these imprisoned zebras and to help them access their wild zebra nature again. My mom defends the zoo again, which only makes me more mad. I watch as a woman from the crowd steps into the zebra ring and am appalled to see that she gets up very close to the central zebra simply to take a selfie with it. I have the thought that I hope the zebra attacks her in response to her disturbing it in this way. The zebra, however, remains statuesque and makes no move toward her. In fact, none of the zebras try and move at all, as though they have forgotten what it is to be zebras. And here's what she says about some context. She says, my parents recently visited me for a few days. I live far away from them. Though I am able to easily slip into a dynamic with them that ensures we get along, I find that to do this requires I distance myself entirely from my own feelings. I feel so separate from them and find them very hard to reach. This is especially true of my mother, who is an active alcoholic and incredibly emotionally unavailable. I long for a deep connection with her, for her to really be a mother to me, but I'm not sure if she is capable of that. And she says the feelings in the dream were anger at how the zebras are being treated, protectiveness of the zebras, loneliness with my mother and among the crowd, and an overarching sadness. And in terms of some association, she says, I used to go to the zoo a lot with my parents as a child. I was so taken with all the animals and loved learning as much as I could about them. In recent years, I've begun to question the ethics of zoos in general, wondering if there can be any case made at all for their existence, as they completely take away an animal's autonomy. The zebras in particular always looked so out of place in an inner city zoo setting, like they were just too wild and unique to be caged in.
So I wonder if I may be permitted to take the lead and then exit. I have my poor wife locked up in her studio where she's painting and doesn't want to appear. I think she probably wants to come out for a snack or something.
Okay,
But
go for it.
so, I think the first thing is that, as I say in the novel, and hope I did somewhat in my practice, is that you really can't interpret dreams without the patient, so that, I understand the exercise and will participate in it, but really I would be asking, not saying at this point, and, what is the number 5 and the circle and so on.
Sure.
But on the face of it, this seems transparent to me. That is, there was this visit, and in this visit, the dreamer felt constrained by her parents. She was able to come to an accommodation, but her own free and wild side was constrained, and she felt kind of on display. And I like the zebra for a reason that is probably idiosyncratic and maybe not the dreamers at all. But I feel like she wants to say, look, this isn't subtle. It's black and white.
Yeah.
That it's not, that the zebra is sort of there because she's entirely right about what's missing in this relationship. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to swap things around with the mother's alcoholism and have her be the zebra and have her have sort of a tame side and a wild side, and which gets on display and who's being looked at. So I don't want to insist on that. I do want, before disappearing, to mention a poem that was the, poem of the day a few days ago by a poet, Megan Nichols, called Interpreting Dreams. And it begins, if everyone in the dream is you and everyone in the dream is you, then when you stand naked in the classroom, you are the classmates, the teacher, and the flesh. And then she ends up with this wonderful thing about verbs where she says, think of yourself, this is one of those dreams where all your teeth fall out. Think of yourself as the fall too, not the thing that will fall or the thing that has fallen, not the force behind the falling, nor the thing that falls. You are the verb, the act of, the motion as it moves. So I just think that's people can look that poem up.
Oh, I love it. I will.
Yeah, but I think this is about the feeling we probably all feel when parents come to stay with us, or now that we're the parents who come to stay with the kids. A little bit of not quite being able to be fully oneself. So, is it all right if I exit with that?
Yes.
And let you
thank you so much for joining us.
I'm going to leave the sound on here, but I won't be recording.
You can just click leave down at the bottom there.
All right, well then I'll listen to the rest of this later. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. Yeah.
I certainly will look up that poem. What a great,
sounds great.
addition.
Yeah. Well, I had the same kind of global take on it that Peter does, is that, our dreamer feels like a zebra, penned up, constrained, and her wildish nature having to be somewhat immobilized in the presence of her parents. The other black and white aspect of zebras is that I've always liked about them, and so does every dress designer throughout history, it seems, is that they're dramatic. The zebra stripes are very cool. There's no mistaking how alive and captivating they are, so that not only does she have to be constrained, but the best, most unique, dramatic interplay of her own black and white, up, down, parts of her personality are suppressed.
So I want to say that the wonderful thing about dreams is they always have multiple layers of meaning. And I think that Peter's right, and you're right, Deb. There is a kind of just so quality about this dream. You know, in some sense, it really articulates the central conflict very clearly. And then I think, and what else does it say? Because, you know, we always like to say on the podcast, the dream comes to bring new information. So the dream must be also delivering something the dreamer doesn't know already. And I imagine, and we've talked about this before, but, you know, we can know something and not really know it. And so the dream might be saying, yeah, you know your mom's an alcoholic who may not really be able to be there for you. But look, let me tell it to you in a different way. But then I'm also curious if there's some other image in there. And one of the interesting things is the person who takes the selfie. And I can so relate to this. I remember, Deb, when you and I were in Vienna together and we went to that museum, I can't remember the name of it right now, but the Gustav Klimt, The Kiss, was there. And it was just so beautiful. And you couldn't see it because everyone was in front snapping a selfie. So that is a real thing. But why that detail in this dream? In what way does she like to in what way does she betray herself and put herself on display and treat herself, treat her wild nature with a kind of instrumentalist or self-promotion? You know, I just am kind of curious about, that's one of the things I'm curious about, I suppose.
So this, you know, just to back it up a little bit, it assumes, as we do in Jungian dream interpretation, that every aspect of the dream is some part of the dreamer. So some part of the dreamer is the woman taking the selfie. And I think the question you're raising, Lisa, is how does she objectify herself?
I resonate with everything you've said and Peter's comments as well. So because the relational dynamics are clear in it, I find myself wanting to zoom out and look at it perhaps more archetypally. So if I imagine the circular pen, there are 4 points and one in the center, then we have an image of a very classic image of a mandala.
It's a zebra mandala.
A zebra mandala, and that these 5 beautiful, instinctive creatures are in a state of statuesque poise. So another way of thinking about it is something that is wild inside of her has been contained and structured by the self, put into a certain statuesque, quiet, patterned place inside of her, that the mother is aligned, as the mother archetype can sometimes be, aligned with this organizing principle in the psyche, and that the ego, for its own purposes, hopes that the mother or this human intervention will be attacked, that her ego is not comfortable in this place of calm orderliness. Now, I understand the feeling that zebras are natural and wild and they deserve to be left, unruined and left in a pure state. And we do love that. But archetypally, our wild creatures inside of us, our instincts, our shadow figures, actually need to be brought into some kind of a psychological and symbolic order so that we can harness our own instincts to other purposes and the purposes of the self. So the ego seems to be the figure that is most at odds with what the psyche is structuring. The psyche has decided to do all these things, and she just really hopes something will happen to tear it down. The idea of the selfie, the central zebra, which reminds me of the little central island in Jung's mandala dream with the white tree growing out of it. You know, somebody is popped in, is taking a little selfie with the self.
Yeah.
Selfie. So there's this questionable ego self, perhaps a superficial attitude of relationship between the ego and the self. But importantly, to me, the self is not disturbed.
Yes.
Even though it may seem sacrilegious or disrespectful, the energy of the self is statuesque enough to tolerate the primary narcissism, really, of the kid that's jumping over the fence and taking selfies and hoping to be seen as, really great. So I would also be exploring issues of containment, issues of self-organization, the orderliness of the psyche and how the ego is or isn't okay with that. And I can also understand that any of the parental complexes that were significant in the organizing of the ego in terms of the timeline, if the mother complex is an ambivalent figure, the mother archetype is also going to seem ambivalent at first because it's going to wear the mask of the biological mother. So the zoo is also the place of caretaking and protection that we now, in the U.S. at least, take species that are on the brink of extinction, and we try to breed them. We try to not let them die. We feed them and bathe them and give them medicine. That it is a great zoos, if they're done well, are great mothering environments and designed to protect as well as educate. I mean, one could put other valences on it, which I understand.
Sure.
But her ambivalence just about that whole field of energy is understandable, complicated.
I think you've really raised a very important aspect of the dream, that there is an archetypal underpinning here that the dream ego isn't aware of, and maybe the waking ego as well. And the mother archetype is here in all the figures in the dream are female.
Oh, yeah.
Our dreamer is female. It is a woman who runs into the center to take the selfie. It is the mother with whom the dream ego has, in effect, an argument about zoos. So I think you're right on.
I found myself curious about the last line, because she says that the zebra remains statuesque, almost as if they have forgotten what it means to be zebras. And I don't know, when I read that, I just had a little kind of question about it, because something about the word statuesque conjures up this incredible dignity. And I wasn't sure that I would agree that the zebra has forgotten what it means to be a zebra, because the zebra is standing in dignity. So, I mean, obviously we'd want to ask the dreamer about that. But Joseph, I think it does go to your point that there is something profound here that's been constellated. And it may be that, and if I were to kind of have an imagination about what that might be, in the face of this woman's real trauma. I mean, having an alcoholic parent is really traumatogenic. She, I imagine, has found within some substantial resources.
Which leans in again to the benefit of the constellation of the self, because being raised, if the mother was the primary caregiver and she's struggling with alcoholism, there's a lot of chaos and unpredictability in the home. Mm-hmm. And so the self may also rise up even during the visit to create some containment, much like a nicely done zoo. These things live here, these things live here. We all take care of it. The lions aren't allowed to jump into the zebra area and create havoc. Like we're all going to put it all aside. I also like the idea that, you can't change a zebra's stripes. It's an old saying,
Yes. Yeah.
which is like the zebras are zebras, and they could also just step right out of those little low rings if they wanted to. But for whatever reason, there's some kind of higher order that's resting down into her psyche in the face of the chaotic memories, which I think is a kind of medicine. It's kind of a shh, it's okay.
I like a lot just the configuration that you lifted up, Joseph, of the circle of the pen with the 5 individual pens and a center. Mm-hmm. And that is, as you said, a mandala. That the dream maker is giving that to our dreamer.
Right.
In juxtaposition to what the dream ego in the dream wants, and what she says in her comments of how she longs for her personal mother to be more available, to really be connected, for her to have a relationship. And she's only 29.
Yeah.
And of course, we still want a mom who feels like a mom. But something
we always
else,
long for that.
Yes, something else is emerging in the psyche. And of course, we have the missing masculine of where is her father in all of this. But that mandala in the middle, and the zebras who are statuesque, and a center, a self that she can take a selfie of, not quite maybe fully developed a relationship with the self as will emerge over time, but it's hinted at, it's prefigured, something is happening way below the level of the dream ego or the waking ego.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.